Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together around 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists from over 100 member countries worldwide. And today on ICMDA webinars, we're really pleased to welcome back Professor John Wyatt to speak to us on yet another subject that's very relevant, understanding Generation Z. So Generation Z, a term that we didn't know not too long ago, but we're living at a time of remarkable and unprecedented changes in behavior, attitudes, and experience amongst young people. Generation Z, those who are, we have to keep updating this, but those who are currently aged 10 to 28 years see the world with different eyes than the rest of us. What have been the formative experiences of this age group? What can we learn from them? And how can we support and encourage young people as they grow into maturity? And to really stimulate our thinking on this, Professor John Wyatt has come. John is Emeritus Professor of Neonatal Pediatrics, University College London. He's a senior researcher at the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, UK, and President of the UK Christian Medical Fellowship, which is the UK affiliate of ICMDA. He has a clinical background as a pediatrician caring for sick and premature babies, and also as a medical scientist researching into the prevention of brain injury in newborn babies. John has always been interested in ethical dilemmas raised by advances in medical technology and frequently engaged in public and professional consultations and debates from the perspective of the Christian faith. His book, Matters of Life and Death, Human Dilemmas at the End, in the Light of the Christian Faith, has been translated into more than 10 languages, but he's a very prolific author. His recent books include The Robot Will See You Now and a chapter on a book on healthy faith and the coronavirus. He and his wife, Celia, are long-standing members of All Souls Church in London. So John, just a pleasure to have you back again, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's a real privilege for me to be here and to share in this webinar. And I'm going to share my screen. So understanding Generation Z, and I want to say straight away that I'm not a great expert in demographics or cultural change. So this is very much an amateurish perspective, as I've described it, some thoughts from a geriatric observer. And but I've been increasingly convinced that those of us, particularly those of us who are older, I mean, there may well be some members of Generation Z, Gen Z, on the call, in which case you're extremely welcome. I'd be very interested to hear any comments that you have subsequently. But I think it is very important for us as older people to be aware of the sort of enormous changes that are taking place in this generation. And these are the rough ages for demographic groups. So I'm a member of the baby boomers, as are many people on the call. Then there was Generation X, and then Generation Y, or sometimes called millennials. But Generation Z, Gen Z, they start in 1995, which is significant, as we'll see, because it's really connected with the ubiquity of smartphones. And so roughly we're talking about people who are 10 or 11 to 28 at the moment. And I've been very helped by this book, which I highly recommend, written by Jean Twenge, who's an American psychologist. It's not a Christian book, but it is very informative with lots of data, and well worth reading. And just as soon as we start, I think there are two obvious dangers that I'm trying to avoid. and one is overgeneralizing, assuming that everyone in one demographic group thinks and behaves in the same way. Of course, members of Generation Z are individuals, human beings like the rest of us, and we must beware of just labeling, thinking that once you've applied a label that applies to everyone, any more than, you know, I'm a baby boomer, but I don't like it when people say, oh, well, all baby boomers think like this, or you're a baby boomer, so you must think this. So we should avoid that. And also we should avoid excessive negativity. You know, young people these days, it's something that older people have been saying for millennia, tutting, shaking their heads about the younger generation. So I really want to try and avoid that kind of geriatric negativity. Most of the data that's available, and I'm going to be rapidly reviewing, comes from the USA. But it's very interesting that increasingly studies that are being done around the world are finding quite similar trends. And I think, actually, if you think about it, this is one of the unique phenomena about Generation Z, because if Generation Z have been formed very largely by internet exposure from early childhood, we shouldn't be surprised to discover that people of the same age group around the world have basically been exposed to a similar global phenomenon, and therefore that they have ended up with quite similar ideas. And it's also interesting that across the different socioeconomic groups, the same kind of trends seem to be appearing. So what is it about Generation Z? And immediately, as these pictures illustrate, one of the phenomena is the smartphone. And the unique thing about this generation is that from the ages of 10 or 11, the large majority of these people have been continuously using a smartphone. They've had a smartphone in their hand. And that's the significance of the birth date of 1995, because the iPhone was launched in 2007, and it was, many people trace the launch of the iPhone to the time when smartphones really took off and became ubiquitous. And so these children have had continuous exposure through their smartphones to social media, to internet videos, to computer games, and very importantly, and we'll come back to this, to internet pornography. And the statistics are astonishing. So one study showed that people in this generation on average use a smartphone for 7.5 hours a day, or 50+ hours per week. Another statistic, the average teen checks her phone more than 80 times a day. And thinking about pornography, only 3% of boys and 17% of girls have never watched pornography. And the median age that young people are first exposed to pornography is 11 to 13. And these data come from Common Sense Media, which is an American organization which has a lot of resources, helpful resources on the media. And I just took this from some of their data. Nearly 3 in 4 teens have been exposed to pornography. Boys were more likely to view pornography than girls, but a very significant percentage of girls. So over here, the green are boys, the black are boys. So 70% of girls have seen porn. And in terms of watching porn on purpose, 52% of boys, 36% of girls. In terms of by age, 15% have watched porn from 10 or younger, 54% at 13, 73% at 17. So in this study, 12 was the average age when children first looked at porn. And here how frequently 59% of those who intentionally watched it were watching once a week or more. 58% had ever viewed pornography accidentally, 44% viewed pornography on purpose, and 33%, here look, 52% had watched violent pornography. And if you're not aware, the accessibility of horrific, genuine rape, sadomasochism, bestiality, you name it, all of these things are freely available to anyone on a smartphone. It's said that within 3 or 4 clicks, picking up your smartphone, you can have access to horrific, hardcore pornography. So it's immediately obvious that the life experiences that Gen Z have had since the age of 10 or 11, they're radically different from those of their predecessors. So obviously this affects how time is spent, and the statistics are pretty clear. This generation, this age group, tends to spend more time at home alone and on a screen, either a phone, a tablet, or a laptop. And there's less time in face-to-face social interaction, in home study, in meeting with friends, or in any kind of social clubs or communities. Some people have suggested maybe part of the problem with Generation Z is that they're pressurized to do so much time on homework from school that or from university that that's the reason they're spending less time with other people. But in fact, the studies refute that. If anything, Generation Z spends less time in homework than other teens used to. What is taking up all their time is engagement with screens. And of course, these trends then were massively exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, which led to very stringent lockdowns. So it seems to me like a double whammy. You've already got a group of children and young adults who are spending far greater time alone and on screens, and then they're exposed to a lockdown when it's simply not possible for them to meet face-to-face with others. So what do they do on their smartphones? Well, this is comparing the light purple are Generation Z and the darker bars are millennials. And at the top is listen to music, 78%, watch videos, 75%, 63% play games, 56% take pictures, 51% send pictures or videos. And this is looking at the hours spent on different internet platforms. And this is in the USA, September 2022. And astonishingly, TikTok is now way ahead the platform on which most time is spent. For those of you who don't know, TikTok is a specialized app which you can record and find very short form videos lasting seconds or a few minutes at the most. The next commonest platform was YouTube, then Instagram and Snapchat. You can see that Facebook is nowhere to be seen. Facebook is for old people, but not for the Generation Z. So again, I'm now going to show some more graphs. So I don't want to completely overload you with data, but I think it's just very striking to see this consistent pattern. And one of the very consistent patterns is the reduction in face-to-face meeting with friends. So we're seeing across all the age groups a reduction in face-to-face contact. But notice how dramatic this reduction is for 15 to 24 in this. There's again a USA report. So back in 2003, this age group was spending on average 2 to 3 hours a day just hanging out face to face with their friends. That's what teenagers used to do. And now look how this has just fallen off a cliff in terms of the amount of face-to-face time this generation are spending. And so studies have shown repeatedly that there's slower social and emotional development. And it seems that Generation Z are effectively spending more time in childhood and less in what we used to think of what traditional adolescence was like, particularly rebellion. I want to live my own life. I'm going to, go and hang out with my friends. And so many people have commented that there seems to be delayed emotional and interpersonal maturity, so that 18-year-olds these days are tending to behave much more like 15-year-olds 20 years ago, and the same kind of trend, 21-year-olds are behaving more like 18-year-olds and so on. And interestingly, whereas adolescents of the past, I mean, I can remember when I was an adolescent in the 1960s, I was desperate to get away from my parents and desperate to get away from home. I wanted to live my own life. I wanted to make my own decisions. Interestingly, there's a strong trend that Generation Z now actually they used to what are called helicopter parents, parents who are constantly there to support and guide. And they welcome it. They want parental input and supervision and advice. They feel unsafe unless there's an adult who is there to turn to. And this is having an impact on university students and on university staff, that undergraduate students, there's been this tendency that they actually welcome adult supervision and guidance and protection. They don't feel capable of making the same kind of independent decisions they used to. Now, again, I want to stress, of course, these are generalizations. They don't apply to everybody. There are always going to be outliers, but we're just looking at the overall trends and the direction of travel. So because of this continuous exposure to the internet, there's a changing communication styles. And interestingly, many people in Generation Z, they don't actually like face-to-face talking too much. They find it rather uncontrolled, complicated, unpredictable, stressful. They much prefer communicating through texts, sending emojis, sending GIFs, graphic video files, and this asynchronous communication. So I can form what I want to say, I think about it, I send this cute, trendy text with some emojis, and then I wait for you and you think about it, and then you think about something cool, and then you can send it back. And so this is much more controlled rather than this free-floating, unstructured, real-time face-to-face conversation. And then there's an increasing preoccupation with safety, both physical safety. The world feels very physically unsafe. I'm much safer when I'm in my bedroom, when I'm at home, when I'm in a safe place, but also mental and emotional safety. And so that's why this generation tend to be preoccupied with the need for safe spaces, with trigger warnings. I want you to warn me if something unpleasant is going to be said, if something challenging, if I'm going to be exposed to something potentially traumatic. And so for many of this generation, the idea is that exposure to unwelcome opinions and ideas, that's potentially traumatizing. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear someone disagreeing with me. This is not only traumatizing, it's dangerous. You're endangering me by challenging my beliefs. And at the same time, we're seeing very marked increases in rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. And in some of the data that I'll show you now, you can see that it's particularly girls who are showing the greatest rise in mental health symptoms. And this seems to be strongly associated with cyberbullying, with the shaming that goes on in the internet between girls, and also watching videos and social media posts of self-damaging behavior of different kinds. I'm going to show you some data now. Many of them come from a Substack by the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, and I will give you the details of that at the end. But this is USA high school students, and showing a rise, particularly in persistent feelings of sadness, poor mental health, attempting suicide, and so on. And here are some graphs. So this is feelings of persistent sadness or hopelessness. We got 36% in 2011 for girls. So the girls are in the light blue, boys are in the black. You can see that the girls already start off higher than boys, but then there's this marked rise, so that 57% of USA students said that they experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. This is a similar graph now looking at the percentage who seriously considered attempting suicide. So again, the girls start higher than the boys, but notice how the girls go up significantly, whereas the boys remain constant with time. This is US teens with a diagnosis of a major depression, and this is a percentage. And this is 2004, 2020, the boys are in blue, the girls are in yellow. And again, we're seeing this really quite dramatic rise in both boys and girls, but particularly girls. This is the prevalence of anxiety from 2008 to 2018, and by different age groups. And this is the blues are the 18 to 25. These are the older age groups. The 50s plus haven't shown any change. If anything, they've shown a decrease. The younger people have shown an increase in anxiety. The greatest increase is with 18 to 25. Similar data, this is data from England, anxiety and depression in young children, again showing rises. This is UK teens with self-harm. And this is girls who've been hospitalized as a result of self-harm. And again, significant rises in both girls and boys. So given those data, it's not surprising that there is this preoccupation with mental safety, this sense of mental vulnerability, which characterizes many of Generation Z. And another issue is a mistrust of established institutions, religious, academic, political, and the media. And here there is definite connections with the Nick Land, the webinar that he gave here a week ago. If you haven't seen that webinar on identity and the self, I strongly recommend you to watch that as well, because there are lots of connections between these changes in understanding of the self, understanding of the world, and what's happening in Generation Z. But there's a general mistrust of authority, and this postmodern view that all authority represents patriarchy, oppression, coercion, and potential for abuse. And some university educators have noticed that increasingly it seems that the role of students, university students, seems to be they come to university not primarily with the intention of submitting to the academic authority of older and more experienced people, but they actually far more willing and prepared to challenge what they see as patriarchal and outdated attitudes of the staff. And then another very noticeable trend is this erosion of belief in objective and external truth. Feelings and emotions are increasingly seen as a more reliable guide to truth than education or reason or external authorities. And so we hear these kind of phrases: I need to find my own truth. I need to be true to myself, to my own experience. And this phrase, lived experience, the most important thing is I want to be true to my lived experience. Yes, you are telling me all kinds of truth, but I'm not sure I can believe it. It's my lived experience which is the most important. Access to screens, continuous access to the internet changes cognitive style. So a shortening attention span, some difficulties in sustaining long, detailed logical analysis, but much greater skill at rapid internet searching and browsing, at identifying information, at multitasking. Interestingly, there's some evidence that during the pandemic, book reading, the reading of books, rose. But again, it's fascinating to see what the titles were. This looks at changes in the genres of reading. The yellows are Generation Z, and the blacks are all the rest. And so interestingly, during the pandemic, there was an increase in reading across the board, but the genres that Generation Z were particularly into was fantasy and science fiction, horror, superhero action, romance, and YA, which is young adult reading. I've already shown this again, the fascination with video, and especially with TikTok. And again, as we saw, as Nick Land talked about last week, this rise in individualism, focus on the self, the internally experienced self, and the importance of self-expression. And yet, at the same time, many members of Generation Z are committed to equality, to inclusiveness, to non-judgmentalism, and freedom from oppression for all minorities. So social justice, commitments to equality is very important to many members of this group. Many of them are passionately committed to minimizing climate change, and at the same time, many of them are fatalistic about the future, even believing that humanity is doomed. They want to maintain virtue signaling and appear to their peers to be backing the right the right causes, and yet in practice many of them are not very politically active in terms of activism and engaging with political parties and so on. This was a recent survey of Christian teenagers in the UK, run by the Youthscape charity. What social issues are you most concerned about? And there the answers: discrimination, poverty, and climate change. So there's this huge focus and preoccupation with these social justice issues. And at the same time, there's a rejection of conventional sexual and gender stereotypes and roles, and frankly, atypical attitudes to sexual behavior. So on the one hand, there's a real fear of sexually transmitted infections. There's a fear of rape, of non-consensual sex. There's a fear of teenage pregnancy and so on. And yet there's also this frequent exposure to hardcore pornography through the internet. And so many Generation Z seem to have a preference for virtual rather than physical, personal sexual activity. They prefer sexting and the sharing of intimate photos and videos, and that's seen as perfectly normal behavior. So just to summarize all that, it's a pretty daunting list, and it does illustrate some of these very significant changes in attitudes. So as I come towards the end, I've already said most of these have been exhausted by the COVID pandemic lockdowns. So what can we learn from this generation before we dive into criticism and concern. What can we learn? And I think one of them is a strong desire for authenticity and a suspicion of hypocrisy. They feel that so often the older generations, there really isn't a consonance between the internal feelings and the external behavior, and they want to be authentic. As we've seen, they have a commitment to equality and inclusiveness and social justice. And I think compared with previous generations, a positive thing is that they're much more aware of the importance of mental health, and they're prepared to acknowledge their own mental vulnerability, compared with previous generations where there was still a lot of denial, a lot of stiff upper lip. This generation has really understood and the importance of mental health. And then thinking back last week to what Nick Land was talking about, I think this reflects the importance of psychology, the psychologization, the therapeutic attitudes. But in my view, it's not all negative. I think there are very positive things here about recognizing the importance of mental health issues. As we've heard, they have a commitment to minimizing climate change, environmental degradation. I think that's very positive. They also are much more aware of the possibility that all institutions and established authorities are at risk of corruption, hypocrisy, and abuse of power. So they recognize that slavish and unthinking conformity to established patterns of behavior is not necessarily desirable or healthy. And I think that's something, again, which older generations have often got wrong. We've been overinvested in particular institutions and authorities, and we have something to learn from this younger generation. It's fascinating that the revival, so-called revival, that happened in the USA at a Christian university, Asbury University, earlier in 2023, has been described possibly as Gen Z's first revival. A bit of boasting rights here. This actually is an article by my son, Tim Wyatt, who is a professional journalist writing for Premier Christianity magazine. But he had a very interesting discussion with a number of people who'd been there at Asbury, and they commented how this quest for authenticity, to avoid the celebrity worship leaders, to just have a genuine, authentic expression of Christian worship and prayer. So how can we help Gen Z most effectively as I come to the end? Well, I think we need to take account of this delayed emotional and social development. University students, I think, may welcome more senior guidance, more supervision than we thought previously. I think clearly they need help to develop healthy habits of reading, daily rhythms of spiritual practices, of prayer and Bible study, the importance of conversation and face-to-face friendships, engaging in community activities, trying to encourage them to get off their screens and engage in face-to-face conversation. And I think developing safe community spaces for this generation to engage in these kind of conversations, friendships, communal activities. Many people have pointed out that in modern life, they're sometimes called third spaces, spaces which are not at home and they're not either at work or at school. They are other places. Many of these have been hollowed out or completely removed. And that means there is nowhere safe where people can go and just hang out, unsupervised, unmonitored, without their helicopter parents. They can just have face-to-face friendships. But it does also seem to me that if ever there was a time for intergenerational friendships, it's now. Intergenerational friendships with older adults seem to me to be a critical factor in encouraging Gen Z to develop to maturity. And we need to learn afresh the extraordinary value and the potential of Paul Timothy friendships, of an older and a younger person coming alongside. a beautiful description I read of intergenerational friendship is it's like engaging in time travel. I'm learning to see what the world looks like through different eyes, and together we're increasing understanding and mutual support across the generations. And so I think one of the things, many of us watching this webinar, and I say it to myself, we need to take the initiative in reaching out in friendship and concern and love to younger friends. You know, would you like to come and have a cup of coffee? Why don't we just meet up and have a chat? I'm interested in hearing more about your experience. What's going on for you at the moment? And of course, there's this important reminder which comes throughout the scriptures that we as older people have a responsibility to teach our children and our children's children. Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. So we as older Christians have a responsibility not to forget what God has been doing in our lives, what we've been learning, and to make them known, to pass them on to our children and our grandchildren, our spiritual children and our biological children. How can we encourage them? Can we encourage ways of reducing screen time and smartphone addiction? Many people are suggesting that we should increasingly enforce a 16-year-old age limit for unrestricted access to social media and internet surfing. It's not an accident that in many countries, 16 years is taken as the age at which an individual is capable of giving consent, genuine consent for sexual activity. And so if sex is so important that we restrict it and we say that younger people are not capable of giving consent, why on earth do we allow 10-year-olds to have unlimited access to the internet? And then I think we should encourage young people to engage in cultural analysis, to try to understand the strange new world they find themselves in, to try to understand, just as we're struggling to understand what's going on, we should encourage them to do the same. And we should be looking out for best practice. So just to finish, here are some resources I've found very helpful. The book by Jean Twenge, iGen. These are two books by Andy Crouch and his daughter, Amy. I think they're outstandingly helpful books for all parents and grandparents. If you've got children and you're worried about technology, how to help children to grow up in a world of technology. These are the two books from Carl Trueman that Nick Land referenced. And again, I would strongly recommend them both as being really important and valuable ways of understanding the changes in the modern world. Jonathan Haidt is a professional psychologist, a very important, influential voice in this area. He's not a Christian, but he is a very influential thinker. He has a Substack, which you can access for free. And a lot of the data that I've shown actually come from that Substack. It's regularly updated with new research, and I think it's a really important source of information, which I recommend. Commonsense.org, an American organization particularly concerned about the media and the impact on young people, and Youthscape, a British organization particularly for Christian youth workers and others working with youth. And finally, just to mention my own website at johnwyatt.com, where I'm going to be putting up more information and more material and articles, and also a weekly podcast that I do with my son, Tim, called Matters of Life and Death. So that's the end. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, John. Really comprehensive and helpful overview, and lots of questions coming in now. So we've got a time for Q&A. So first of all, question, John, from Claudia Stein, who's saying, how would you explain that Generation Zers tend to be less rebellious overall, but on the other hand, more willing to challenge patriarchy. It seems a little bit incongruous. You know, these folk who want their parents around are more ready to challenge institutions and authorities.
Yes, a fascinating combination, isn't it? And I'm not sure I can totally explain that, but if you think about it, I think it does make sense. If I am, on the one hand, I'm exposed to the internet where I'm seeing all this activity and all this emphasis on social justice, and I'm following influencers and so on, and they're all banging on about patriarchy and about oppression and so on. And of course, I absorb all those attitudes. But actually, when it comes to me personally, I feel very scared. It's a nasty, dangerous world out there. And the safest place is in my bedroom. And especially if I know that there's a grown-up guarding the door. Of course, it isn't safe even in my bedroom. I can be bullied 24/7 by my friends through my smartphone, but at least I'm physically safe, and I feel very anxious. I feel frightened for my safety. I feel the world is a very dangerous place. So I think you can see how, on the one hand, I can be theoretically totally committed to social justice and all that, while at the same time feeling personally quite frightened and quite timid.
Well, and it's interesting too, isn't it, that you talked about the way of protesting, that iGeners are far less likely to, you know, write a letter to a newspaper, engage with their MP, go on a demonstration, and so on, much more likely to make a comment on social media, perhaps, you know, because it's safer to do it and less threatening, and perhaps even more anonymous to do it that way, and doesn't draw attention to you in the same.
I think that's absolutely right. And that's one of the things I know that the political parties and political activists are very concerned about. They're finding it harder and harder to get buy-in from this generation of actually turning up to meetings, of turning up to demonstrations and so on.
Yes. Just a question about the gospel and people's receptivity. What in your view makes Generation Z more, or on the other hand, less open to the gospel message? I mean, perhaps in two parts. Have you seen any data on receptivity to the gospel message from this generation? And then some comments about what makes it more or less conducive.
Yeah, that's interesting, Peter, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. But what I have heard from people working in the university's Christian world is that there does seem to be a remarkable openness in this generation at the moment to the gospel, and that evangelistic outreaches of various kinds are actually seeing increased numbers of people expressing interest. There's so little knowledge now about the Bible, so little knowledge about Christianity and so on, that actually that a lot of people seem to be genuinely interested. They want to find out, you know, what weird things do Christians believe and why. So I think there is, at one level, there's an openness, but at the same time, I think the institutions, unfortunately, you know, the established church, the public image of the Church of England or of any established denominations, of course, is often extremely negative. The abuse scandals, the evidence of hypocrisy, all the worst aspects of institutional Christianity seem to be displayed publicly. And of course, I think that creates a real barrier, and it's really important, therefore, to differentiate ourselves as people with a living faith in the Lord Jesus from the image of established Christianity.
Well, as you said, there's a sense of crying out for authentic, you know, true authenticity and authentic relationships as well. Just a question of clarification regarding to the data on pornography. We've got the question, do you mean watching it as a habit or coming across pornographic things accidentally online? I was interested how the data you presented showed a difference between those two things. And I was surprised at how high the just coming across pornography accidentally online was.
Yes, exactly. So I think the answer is it's both. I think that when it comes to accidental exposure to pornography, virtually everybody, I mean, over 85, 90% of Gen Z are accidentally exposed to it. You know, just by accident, you click on something and wham, there it is. And of course, this can happen to all of us, but it's particularly common for people surfing around on the smartphones. But again, a very significant percentage in the boys, in the one study that it showed there, over 50% were accessing pornography intentionally, and many more than once a week. So a very significant one. And of course, this is because pornography has this addictive trend, and it's very easy, particularly for boys, but also for girls as well, to find themselves trapped in an addictive cycle of seeking out pornography, of getting an instant gratification, then of shame and feelings of disgust, and then the cycle starts again. And many, I'm afraid, young people get themselves trapped in this because of it's easy. It's all there for free, and much of it, I'm afraid, is absolutely horrific.
And I guess, is that accentuated by the neuroplastic nature of the adolescent brain as well? You know, at a stage where you're kind of laying down neuronal pathways
Absolutely.
and more susceptible to addictive phenomena, you know, whether it's pornography or, you know, even just clicking on a smartphone.
I think that's absolutely right. That's one of the very concerning things. I was talking to a young pastor in his early 30s who was telling me he'd been trying to help a younger man with relationship problems, and the way he described it to me, he said it turned out that his brain has been scrambled by 10 years exposure to pornography. And it's this, if you have this continuous exposure to these extraordinary, powerful and yet aberrant stimuli, what does that do to the connections? What does that do to the developing central nervous system?
Yeah,
I do wonder whether future generations will look back at us and say, how on earth could they have been so crazy as to allow their young people to be exposed to this?
yes. I guess we're seeing a real rise, aren't we, in so-called process addictions, behavioral addictions, as opposed to substance misuse, I'm sure related. Question on medical education. Emma Haywood, who's involved in medical education, is asking, do you have any advice or suggestions for us, for those in medical education who actually find ourselves teaching less emotionally mature students, you know, at the same age? You talked about today's 18-year-olds had a maturity of yesterday's 15-year-olds. Medicine's a topic that requires maturity and also acceptance of facts and authority, you know, the GMC and so on. So, I mean, you of course have, you know, had a huge background in teaching as well, but any suggestions?
It's a fascinating area. My hypothesis is that medical students as a group will be less affected by this than many other groups. And I think the reason for that is, even to get into medical college, you have to do so much work away from your phone. You know, if you were spending all this time on your smartphone, you simply would never pass your exams and you'd never get into medical school. So I think medical students are possibly less severely affected. I'm sure the trends are still there. I hope that they're less severely affected than others. But it does make you think. I think it's a very good point. I would think that in terms of educational styles, you should think about how you would teach sixth formers, because that's likely to be the most effective education for 18, 19-year-old undergraduates. Yeah. And I think it does raise the question, doesn't it, about, you know, does a modern day 18-year-old have the emotional maturity to be engaging with the kind of immensely, I mean, genuinely traumatic things which clinical practice exposes you to? You know, in many medical schools these days, 18-year-olds are expected to be attending clinical, engaging in clinical practice, shadowing doctors and other health professionals. And I think it's a very good question. Have they got the emotional maturity to be able to cope with that?
Yeah. And if we're talking about the 11 to 28-year age group, then we've got a lot of new medical graduates who are theoretically 3 or 4 years younger emotionally than they were 15 years ago as well. So they're carrying big medical responsibility, you know, in the sort of 23 to 28 age group.
Yeah, you would speculate, wouldn't you, that actually a good clinical education, undergraduate clinical education, would be a kind of crash course in growing up, because, you know, you're suddenly being exposed to dramatically challenging events and experiences and so on. I suppose, again, it's not surprising that among medical students, we're seeing elevated rates of anxiety, depression, mental health disorders, and so on.
Yeah. Now, the stats you presented on depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation were really striking, and particularly the difference between boys and girls. That was really quite dramatic. On suicide itself, you know, it's always been said that men are often more serious in terms of, you know, carrying it through. Are females from Generation Z more likely actually to commit suicide than males from the same generation? Have you seen any data on that, or is it really just about suicidal ideation?
I think to be honest, I'm not sure of up-to-date figures, but my impression is that it is largely what's often called parasuicide. It's not, they don't actually succeed intentionally. And it's much more under the heading of a cry for help. Of course, what sometimes tragically happens is that people intend a cry for help, and then it goes wrong, and they do actually end up killing themselves. So I think there is real concern about this, but I think it's more a marker of the level of distress. And there's also a lot of concern about videos where they're modeling self-harm, they're modeling suicidal thoughts, they're modeling negative emotions. These algorithms can rapidly channel. If you once see one negative video, then all of a sudden the algorithm will be suggesting more and more depressive, self-harming, negative videos. And it's easy to see how a vulnerable young person could just find themselves channeled by all this negative doom and gloom.
Yeah. So coming back to the issue of pornography again, and you said people are much more likely to engage in digital forms of sexuality, if you like, you know, sexting, sending photographs, and so watching videos. Has this led to increased sexual activity and promiscuity, or is it sort of cancelled out by the you know, less confidence in social interaction? Have you seen data on that?
I think the data, if anything, suggests that it's less sexual activity. I mean, this is the physical sexual activity. This is the paradox. We've never had a more sexually obsessed culture.
Yeah.
But actually, it's increasingly digital, virtual, non-physical. Certainly, rates of teenage pregnancy are dropping. Rates, I think, of sexually transmitted infections, although again, I think that varies in different places. So I think there is a move, a much greater fear of the risks of physical sexual transmission, and it's much safer to do it in your bedroom and to do it virtually. But I think the mental consequences of all that are deeply troubling. It's a kind of promiscuity of the mind, which carries its own emotional burdens. And I think when it comes to then establishing really strong monogamous faithful, committed relationships later on in life, the worry is that this generation will find that harder and harder because of their experiences.
And, as we were talking about earlier, the whole influence of neuroplasticity, the adolescent brain, unhelpful neuronal pathways being laid down, which in your anecdote about the pastor trying to get through to someone with 10 years of scrambled thoughts and exposure is a huge challenge. So we're almost run out of time, but just one last question. This is probably quite a big one, but just maybe some thoughts. Rod McRory is asking, do we need to change the way that we do church to cater for Generation Z better? And if so, in what kind of ways? You've already talked about the importance of intergenerational relationships and, people in the older generation really taking the initiative to initiate safe face-to-face interactions. But what about as church communities?
Yes, it's interesting. I've just come back from a church week away, and the wonderful thing about it is it was all age groups from 0 to 100. And there was this wonderful sense of intergenerational community. And one of the nice things is that they had the young people between 13 and 17 going around and serving the older people in terms of bringing cups of coffee and tea and other things like that. And it was just a beautiful sense of us all being in this together. And it made me think that, increasingly this aspect of church community, the fact that every age group is welcomed together, is going to be a wonderful witness in our society, a very countercultural witness, but also I think a very healthy, restorative environment against all these negative influences. So I suppose I wouldn't want to end up with a doom and gloom. I would want to end up with the resilience that God has put in the human mind, in the human frame, that the creation goodness can overcome even all this negative stuff, that it can be redeemed and transformed by the power of the gospel, by the power of the Holy Spirit, but also by the Christian community really living it out, and these intergenerational links, learning from one another and growing together.
Yeah, and I guess that there's no community on earth, is there, that's more intergenerational and more multicultural than the church, and maybe that's a real witness to the strength of the gospel and being able to model these intergenerational relationships, get people out of their silos and echo chambers and into wider relationships with more people who are not like them, apart from the fact that they share the faith.
Exactly. So if there's any take-home message for me, and I see this in one of the comments, is that we should resist this idea of just taking the young people, treating them as kind of alien species and sticking them into their own group. And instead we should welcome them in to the all-age service. We should be, the churches should be the places where we can be having a genuinely positive interaction between the different age groups. And as you say, if you look across society, where else do you see 0 to 100 having a role to play, being welcomed and being celebrated? It's almost like the church is the last place where this is genuinely happening.
Absolutely. Well, there's lots more questions. We could go on talking for some time on this, but sadly we have run out of time. John, thanks so much for your time, and also particularly for your time in preparation and research, for distilling it down for us so well. Thanks to all of you for joining us on ICMDA webinars. We look forward to seeing you again next week, same time, same place. May the Lord bless you.